Today on Let's Talk Politics.
The judge's own political attitude decide outcome of the courts are failing to live up to their proper job. Judicial statesmanship, executive power beyond the limits of the Constitution.
My name's Cecelia, and I'm here virtually with Roger Smith, the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science here at Penn. Professor Smith's research centers on constitutional law, American political thought, and modern legal and political theory, with special interest in questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. His most recent book, That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood, hit the press in June 2020. Professor Smith, thank you for being here with me today, virtually, of course.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Glad you're here. I'm just going to jump into the first question. So, the Penn Political Review is currently conducting interviews around the theme of American constitutionalism, specifically new issues and questions in the field that have sprung up in recent years. You are one of the most prominent scholars of the historical institutionalism model for examining American constitutional law. Could you explain for our listeners what this model dictates and what, considering the courts as governing institutions, might reveal to us about this developing era of constitutionalism?
The behavior of courts has traditionally been approached from two basic models. There is a traditional legal model that views the courts as overwhelmingly devoted to the exercise of simply deciding what authoritative legal texts and precedents preceding cases imply for the questions brought before the court, and they make a good faith effort to decide new cases in light of precedents and in light of those authoritative texts. This has been sometimes called a kind of mechanical approach to judicial decision-making, but it does capture a lot of what lawyers and judges think they're supposed to be doing. At the same time, those authoritative legal materials often don't produce any very clear or determinate answer on a lot of important questions. And there are many political scientists who think that, especially at the Supreme Court level, where the cases that the court considers always have good arguments for both sides, that in fact the judge's own political attitudes and preferences decide the outcome of the cases. And this is generally associated with a view that courts are failing to live up to their proper job in the American constitutional system. The historical institutional approach that I and others take looks at the court as a governing institution, as you noted, and a governing institution with some special characteristics. It does provide a service to governance by resolving conflicts consistently with preceding legal authorities in cases insofar as it can, but it also does confront ambiguities and uncertainties in legal sources. And our view is that the court tries to resolve those in ways that it thinks will lead to effective governance for the country. And that involves a lot of considerations, including the court's concern to protect the power of the judiciary as an institution, but the court's concern also to make sure that the other branches do have powers to solve problems in appropriate ways. And those judgments are inevitably shaped in part by judges' political attitudes and preferences. But we believe that looking at courts as institutions that are trying to ensure that the constitutional system governs effectively and in accordance with existing law as far as possible, that's the best way to understand what the courts are up to.
What do you see as sort of the defining constitutional issues or cases of this time period? Like, what can we expect from the court moving forward?
What we can expect very much depends on what the new Biden administration puts on the agenda of the court. Now, the court we have currently has been staffed in recent appointments by President Trump with a concern to satisfy that part of his constituency that holds the view that religious liberties are under assault in this country. That's a debatable view, but many conservative evangelicals in particular do hold it. And the result has been the appointment of three judges, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, that all their record shows that they believe that the court should be more protective of religious liberties. And that doesn't necessarily result in many challenges to the national governing agenda, but it has pushed for exceptions to policies of health coverage under the Affordable Care Act, requiring employers to provide plans that cover contraceptives, issues of assistance for abortion services, for example, as well as controversies over whether LGBTQ plus rights have to be recognized and so forth. I think we can expect that kind of agenda concerned with religious liberty to remain prominent with these justices on the bench. But it's also true that the Biden administration is seeking to pass very extensive national legislation in the area of health care to respond to the pandemic, in the area of economic and environmental regulation to respond to the economic collapse and to climate change. And those big bursts of national economic regulatory power may well be litigated pretty massively by conservative groups who think the federal government is doing things it shouldn't do. And the Supreme Court is likely to hear a lot of those disputes. How deferential they are to the Congress and the president, how opposed they are, that'll be a big determinant of the court's agenda in the years ahead.
What's your perspective on recent calls for court packing, an initiative to add more justices to the court in order to make it more ideologically balanced?
FDR, at what he thought was the peak of his popularity, tried court packing and found his plan repudiated even by members of his own party because it appeared to Americans at that time in 1936 37 as an effort to aggrandize executive power beyond the desirable limits of the constitutional separation of powers. And I think that much of that mindset still persists in 21st century America. President Biden and his allies in Congress would probably be advised not to pursue something as potentially unpopular and unsuccessful as court packing until and unless the court strikes down major pieces of Biden's Build Back Better agenda. There's no sense really in their efforts to go pick that fight if the Supreme Court isn't actively and consistently opposing what they're doing, and it's far too early to tell if that will happen. Biden administration also faces tremendous immediate challenges that really should be its focus right now. So I think any talk of court packing in terms of changing the number of Supreme Court justices or anything like that is premature at best and probably unwise. I also think, however, that the Biden administration should seek to be more successful in getting nominees for lower court positions advanced and approved. The Obama administration was not nearly as energetic in that regard as the Trump administration was, with the result that the federal judiciary has been pushed in a Trump Republican direction.
During the Trump presidency, the integrity and structure of the Supreme Court and even lower courts was under near constant partisan attacks from both sides, with the president at one point accusing a potential Supreme Court appointee of being an Obama judge. So we know the judicial branch is supposed to be, or the court is supposed to be nonpartisan and not be swayed by partisan politics. But would you consider this type of Supreme Court-related discourse unprecedented, and has this discourse undermined the mission or structure of the court, perhaps revealing an underlying vulnerability of the judicial branch?
It's hardly unprecedented. In Thomas Jefferson's administration, they impeached a federal judge for being too pro-federalist, and the perception that judges were voting along partisan lines therefore goes back through the whole history of the country. It is certainly true that as the Supreme Court has come to play a larger role in governance over the last couple of generations than it has at some other points in American history, and as we've moved to a situation where Supreme Court nominees not only appear before Congress, which they didn't begin doing until the early 20th century, public is more aware of partisan battles over Supreme Court justices than in the past. So far, the analysts of public opinion say this has only slightly diminished respect for the prestige of the Supreme Court. It's not at its historic height, but it's also still more respected than the other institutions of national governance. But it is true that the more every nomination and every decision is discussed primarily in partisan terms, it does infringe on the capacity of the court to play its distinctive role as a governing institution in America. It is supposed to be the governing institution that is somewhat removed from the immediate political fray.
Is there anything that can be done to sort of if not reverse, alleviate these issues with partisan perception moving forward?
Well, there are two directions to go in. First, the court itself can continue to emphasize the reality that most of its decisions are unanimous, and it can, as Chief Justice John Roberts is trying to do, to put together coalitions as often as possible so that courts are decided in ways that mean that they don't break down simply along conservative and liberal lines. There's usually several different avenues for resolving a particular judicial dispute, and you can get different coalitions on the court for those different outcomes. He's already shown he's willing to make sure that decision is reached that can get broader support. That's a kind of judicial statesmanship, if you like it, judicial politics, if you don't, that can help keep the court from making decisions that look simply partisan. They aren't simply partisan, although they are made with an awareness of partisan conflicts. Now, there are many Democrats that are instead attracted now not so much to trying to take the court out of politics, but to make sure that the court isn't unduly responsive to current political views. And that's one device to do that is not court packing, but to create term limits for Supreme Court justices. That would require a constitutional amendment. But recently, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the nation's leading scholarly organizations, issued a report on strengthening American democracy, and what they suggested included a recommendation for term limits for Supreme Court justices. It's an idea that we're hearing more about than we did in the past, and I should note Penn students in my courses are showing a lot of interest in that idea.
What's your personal take on sort of the feasibility or success of an amendment to limit term limits?
As with court packing, I would not make it a priority right now. The nation has too many really urgent needs. In addition to fighting the pandemic, strengthening the economy, addressing climate change, we have a related need for a really huge infrastructure program, investing in the many different forms of infrastructure that are decaying now. We have to do something about the festering issue of immigration. And in comparison with those priorities, I would put the difficult fight for a constitutional amendment to create term limits for justices pretty far down the list. Nonetheless, I do think that it's something that should be considered in the years ahead, although I'd add on the things that should take higher priority if we want to strengthen American democracy, and I think we need to, a whole variety of efforts to improve our voting and election systems, to enfranchise as many as possible and make sure that they can vote. That's much more important. If legislation is passed by and supported by large majorities of Americans, I actually don't think that the courts will prove to be such a major barrier over time, not least because the elected officials will be able to appoint new judges as time goes by who support those measures, whether we have term limits or not.
Donald Trump is the only American president to have been impeached twice. So what do these double impeachments and acquittals tell us about the current state of American constitutionalism? Maybe more specifically, do you see this as a historical anomaly specific to Trump and his conduct, or do you predict the constitutional tool of impeachment will be invoked more frequently or with less abandon moving forward?
Well, Donald Trump is certainly a unique individual, and part of his appeal is that he is willing to flout the norms of American politics. Some would say the norms of law-abidingness and common decency more than most American political figures have been willing to do, and certainly not only his two impeachments, but his refusal to accept the legitimacy of the 2020 election, despite some 60 court rulings in favor of its legitimacy, and despite his own top federal legal officials telling him it was a fairly conducted election. That's unprecedented. And I think that's also far more likely to be characteristic of Donald Trump than most other figures to come. At the same time, it is true that the Republican Party, which since the late 19th century has accused the Democrats of graft and corruption in politics, has particularly since the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the so-called Motor Voter Bill, the Republican Party recognizing that its political base is becoming a demographic minority in this country, it has ratcheted up claims that American elections are not conducted with integrity, and it's pushed through lots of laws requiring voter IDs, structuring the conduct of election in terms of registration days and requirements and polling places and so forth, that have created barriers to voting for those Americans they expect will not vote Republican. And they've done it all along with the claim that, well, we're concerned to prevent vote fraud. That means that a part of the country has come to believe that our elections are often fraudulent. And of course, those beliefs were enormously reinforced by Donald Trump's attacks on the 2020 election. Now, if we have an enduring pattern where a significant number of Americans don't regard our elections results as legitimate, then we will deepen the already profound ideological polarization that we're seeing in modern American politics. And it is likely that each party will regard the other as fundamentally illegitimate. When they get into power, they will launch investigations and maybe impeachments to try to purge the opposition. That would, frankly, be pretty disastrous for American constitutional democracy and would indicate that after 100 years of great ascendancy, American constitutional democracy was in significant historic decline. I think that there will be many in both parties that will try hard to make that happen, but it requires rebuilding the trust of the American people in our leaders and our institutions, and that's going to be an uphill climb.
You're a prolific scholar and author. Your book, Civic Ideals, was a finalist for the 1998 Pulitzer Prize in History and won several awards from the American Political Science Association and other similar associations. Your most recent book, That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood, argues that nationalist populists have done a better job than liberals in providing stories of peoplehood that advance their worldview. So on the topic of Biden, how well do you think the Biden administration has done in promoting this type of unifying national storytelling, I guess, so far? And do you think liberals have really begun to learn what some would sort of consider the lessons of the Trump era, which you articulate in your book?
I think that the Biden administration is, both in terms of the policies and in terms of the narrative explaining why those policies are appropriate, it's off to a good start, even though they face this very serious difficulty that on the one hand, there is a need for narrative of national identity and purpose that inspires greater trust and greater unity. Biden is trying to provide that by saying over and over again that our quest must be to build a more perfect union. We have to acknowledge the imperfections of the past, so those that are alienated from the American system. We hear you. We care about your dissatisfactions, both on the right and on the left. We're going to try to address them, and the notion of that being an American means being part of a project to build a more perfect union is a story that many can rightly find inspirational, in my view. At the same time, Biden's particular political circumstances are that if he is going to address the huge problems the country faces right now, he cannot rely too much on efforts at bipartisanship that may prevent anything from getting done. He has to push through his COVID relief bill, and he has to push through infrastructure bill following that, immigration, climate change, and more. And so his challenge is both to show that he is concerned to help build a more perfect union, while often having to act in a partisan way to help solve the nation's problems right now. He can overcome this challenge, I think, if the policies pushed through actually do respond to many of the felt material needs of even those who voted against him. And I know he's very concerned to do that. He can't satisfy all their sense of loss and grievance that the America of today is not the America they envisioned in the past, which they think they like better. But if he has policies that really do provide broad benefits to all, then I think a critical mass of Americans will regain the trust that the government really is trying to work in the interests of all the American people, and that's the big challenge now.
Well, fantastic. Professor Smith, thank you so much for being here with me today on Let's Talk Politics. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Let's Talk Politics with Professor Smith. If you're interested in hearing more, be sure to check us out at pennpoliticalreview.org and to keep your eye out for future podcast episodes.